For 3 years, no one in Whitmore County could fix the car that broke Holt Beaumont's father. Not the dealership in Sudbury that charged $400 just to look at it. Not the restoration specialist who drove up from Toronto with a van full of equipment and left 6 days later with a check and an apology. Not the two engineers from a diagnostic firm in Ottawa who published papers on vintage North American muscle cars and still couldn't explain why a 1969 Dodge Charger with a numbers-matching 440 engine refused to start. 3 years. 11 different mechanics. A car that sat in the back bay of Beaumont's garage on the edge of Kinsley, Ontario. Population 2,400. One Tim Hortons, one stoplight. Like a patient who had stopped believing the doctors would ever get it right. Holt Beaumont was 41 years old, and he had spent those 3 years trying not to think about what the car meant. He was not always successful. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The back bay had its own temperature. Even in July, when the front of the garage was warm enough to work in a t-shirt, the back stayed cool in a way that had nothing to do with the building's insulation. Holt had checked the insulation twice. The temperature difference was real and unexplained, and he had eventually decided it was just the car radiating something. Not heat. The opposite of heat. Whatever it is that things hold when they've been waiting too long. His father, Clifford Beaumont, had bought the Charger in 1987 when Holt was 4 years old. Holt knew this the way he knew the shape of the garage from childhood. Not as information he had ever been told in a single sitting, but as something absorbed slowly over years of being present, while his father talked and worked and talked some more. Clifford Beaumont was the kind of man who narrated his own life as he lived it. A running commentary addressed to whoever happened to be nearby, which in the garage was usually Holt. The car cost him $3,000 from a farmer outside Timmins who had inherited it from a brother and had no use for it. Clifford had driven it home through an October snowstorm, which he considered a good omen. He said the car drove through snow like it was arguing with the road. He said that like it was a compliment. He drove it every summer for 22 years. Not constantly, not carelessly. Clifford was a careful man in the specific way that people are careful about things they love. Attentive to sounds and smells and small variations in the way something behaved. He knew the Charger the way a doctor knows a long-time patient, not just the readings, the whole person. He had a stroke in the shop in 2009 on a Thursday afternoon in early November. He was rotating the tires on a customer's F-150, which was perhaps the most ordinary thing Clifford Beaumont had ever done, and then he was on the concrete floor. He survived, which was the thing that mattered. But the stroke took some things with it. His left hand never recovered completely. His peripheral vision narrowed on the right side. And after 2 years of trying, he had to admit that he could no longer drive the Charger with the confidence it required. He didn't sell it. That was never discussed as a possibility. He moved it to the back bay of the garage and kept it on a battery tender and cleaned it himself on Saturday mornings, which took progressively longer as his left hand gave him more trouble. He died in the spring of 2019, on a morning when the snow was just starting to think about melting. He died in the house he had lived in since 1974, in his own bed, with Holt beside him, which was what he had wanted. He died at 76. He had been the kind of man who finishes things. The garage was the last thing he didn't finish. The first mechanic arrived 8 weeks after the funeral. He came from Sudbury, and he wore a clean button-down shirt to a job that required actual work, which was the first sign. He spent 2 days with the Charger and concluded the carburetor needed replacing. Holt, who had rebuilt that carburetor himself the previous autumn, thanked him and paid him and did not call him again. The others followed at intervals. Some were clearly in over their heads. One was genuinely good, an older man named Bertrand who ran a specialty shop in Barrie and who spent 5 days with the car and came closer than anyone to isolating the electrical fault that was preventing the engine from firing. He called Holt on the 5th evening and said, straight, without the cushioning that most mechanics used around bad news, "I've found something I can't explain," which means I'm either missing something obvious or it's something that isn't in any manual I have access to. He didn't send a bill until Holt called and insisted. That was year 1. By year 2, the failed attempts had cost just over $14,000. Holt was not a wealthy man. He ran the garage himself with one part-time employee, a retired school teacher named Vernon, who had learned automotive repair the way some retired people learn woodworking, methodically with library books, and with an attention to process that made him slow but rarely wrong. The $14,000 was not money Holt had set aside for this. It was money he had been setting aside for other things, smaller things, the category of expense that gets labeled someday and then quietly spends itself on something else. The money was not the point. He knew it was not the point. But when he sat with the Charger on the evenings, he couldn't avoid the back bay. When he put his hand on the hood, the way his father had put his hand on the hood, the way you touch something you're trying to keep believing in. On those evenings, the money had a way of surfacing, not as regret exactly, as evidence. 11 people, $14,000, and still nothing. He was failing the one thing that felt like it mattered. His daughter, Noah, was 7. She had her mother's ears and her father's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She came to the garage after school when Holt didn't have after-school care arranged, which was more often than he'd intended when he first set up the schedule. She did her homework on the workbench in the front bay, surrounded by socket sets and oil change records and the smell of brake cleaner, and she treated this as entirely normal because for her it was. She had never known a version of life that didn't include the garage. Her mother, Sasha, had died 3 weeks after Noah was born. An arterial embolism, fast and without warning, on a Tuesday evening when Holt had gone home to grab a clean change of clothes from the hospital room's closet. He had been in the parking lot when his phone rang. He had sat in the car for an hour before he could stand up again. He did not talk about Sasha often. He talked about her to Noah with the careful steadiness of a man who had decided that his daughter deserved a full picture of her mother, even if the picture was assembled from fragments. He told her the true things, that Sasha had been a geologist who could identify 47 types of rock on site and who had once spent 3 weeks camping alone in the Yukon for a survey project, that she had a particular way of laughing at her own jokes before she finished telling them, which meant the punchline arrived already slightly breathless, that she had thought the name Noah was complete without an H at the end, and she had been right. He did not talk about the parking lot. He talked about Sasha to almost no one else, not because the loss had calcified into something private and defended, but because in Kinsley, Ontario, 7 years later, most people had learned when to leave it alone. He appreciated this more than he had told anyone. The 11th mechanic arrived in August of the 3rd year. His name was Dr. Frank Arsenault, and he had a doctorate in mechanical engineering from the University of Waterloo and had spent 15 years consulting on vintage American muscle vehicles for collectors and auction houses across North America. He had been recommended to Holt by 2 separate people on an online forum for Mopar restoration enthusiasts, both of whom described him in the particular reverential tone that people use for specialists whose reputation precedes them into every room. Dr. Arsenault was 64, silver-haired, and had the calm of a man who had never been wrong about a car and expected this to continue. He brought a graduate student as an assistant. He spent 3 days with the Charger, running diagnostic protocols that Holt did not have the equipment to run himself. On the morning of the 4th day, Holt found him standing in the parking lot of the garage, not inside, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the building from the outside. That was not a good sign. Dr. Arsenault was professional about it. He said the fault appeared to be electrical, but defied standard diagnostic mapping. He said the system was behaving as though something in the original wiring architecture had been modified from factory spec, but that he could not locate the modification. He said that without locating the source, any repair risked compounding the existing problem. He said all of this with the measured regret of a man who had learned to deliver unwelcome news without losing his footing. Holt thanked him. He said the words clearly and without inflection, and waited until Arsenault's rental car was out of the parking lot before he walked back into the garage and stood in the front bay for a while without touching anything. That was when the door to the shop opened and Cassidy Webb came in. She had been driving up from Huntsville to visit her cousin and had pulled in because one of her rear tires had been pulling slightly for the last 40 kilometers, and she didn't trust it on the highway. She was wearing work clothes, not office clothes, real work clothes, paint under her fingernails and steel-toed boots with a crack along the left toe cap. She was maybe 35. She asked if Holt could take a look at the tire, and he said yes, and they didn't say much else while he put it on the lift. What he had noticed, while he was checking the tire pressure and the wheel balance, she walked to the entrance to the back bay and looked at the Charger. Not casually, the way someone looks at something they recognize. He came around the lift to hand her the invoice. She was still looking at the car. "Sorry," she said, not sounding particularly sorry. "Is that a 69? "Yes." She looked at it a moment longer. "What's wrong with it?" He wasn't planning to answer that question. He had stopped answering that question somewhere in year 2 because the answer required a longer explanation than the question warranted, and the longer explanation always arrived at the same place: embarrassment, his and theirs, and he was tired of arriving there. Instead, he said, "Electrical fault. Nobody can find it." She was quiet. She stepped closer to the entrance to the back bay, not presuming to enter, just looking. "What kind of fault?" "The ignition system won't complete a start sequence. Diagnostics show clean." Previous teams assumed the modification was in the carburation, but the carb's not the issue. It behaves like a grounding problem somewhere upstream, but nobody's been able to locate the source. He wasn't sure why he said all of that. He hadn't said all of that to anyone in months. She looked at the Charger for another moment. Then she looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not quite recognition but adjacent to it. The expression of someone cross-referencing something against their own internal catalog. "Can I look at it?" He almost said no. He almost said something polite and deflective that would have closed the question without requiring him to explain why the answer was no, which was, "Because I've been disappointed 11 times and I don't have the reserves for a 12th. Instead, he said, "Sure." She spent 20 minutes in the back bay. She didn't bring any tools. She just looked. Walked slowly around the car, crouched by the front wheel well, stood by the engine bay. With her head tilted at an angle Holt recognized as the angle of someone listening for something you can't quite hear. At one point, she lay down on the shop floor on her back and looked up at the undercarriage, and Holt stood in the entrance to the bay and watched her and didn't say anything. Vernon had appeared from the back of the shop and was watching from a different angle. Vernon did not often watch things he didn't expect to find interesting. She got up from the floor. There was a grease mark along her left forearm that she looked at briefly and then ignored. "What year did your father buy this?" He blinked. He hadn't said it was his father's car. She gestured slightly toward the wall above the workbench at the back of the bay where there was a photograph. Clifford Beaumont standing beside the Charger in the garage parking lot, October 1987, snow on the ground, grinning like a man who has just completed a transaction he will think about for the rest of his life. "Late 80s, she said. "Not a question. 87. She nodded. "There's a modification in the original wiring. Probably added in the early 90s, maybe late 80s. It's hard to say without pulling the harness. A secondary grounding circuit was integrated into the factory architecture. It was a common aftermarket modification for the Mopar platform in that era. Security upgrade, usually. The problem is that over 30-odd years, the insulation on the modified section degrades in a very specific way. Not enough to show as a clean short or an open circuit, just enough to create a resistance variation under specific thermal conditions. The ignition management sees it as a sensor error and shuts down before the cycle completes." Holt looked at her. He was aware that Vernon had stopped pretending to do something else. "Every team that looked at this car," she said, "was looking for a component failure. There isn't one. There's just a modified ground path that nobody knew was modified because it's hidden inside the factory sleeve, and it's been degrading for 30 years in a way that only shows up under exactly the right conditions." He said, "How do you know about this modification?" She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone choosing how much to give. "I used to work in automotive engineering," she said. "I specialized in electrical systems integration for North American performance platforms. The Mopar B-body architecture was one of the platforms I spent a significant amount of time with." "Used to," he said. She looked at the photograph on the wall. "Yeah," she said, "used to." He didn't ask the next question. He had learned, in the 7 years since the parking lot, when not to push the next question. "Can you fix it?" he asked instead. She looked at the car. "I think so. I'd need a couple of days, and I'd need access to your tools." He looked at her. She had a grease mark on her arm and cracked steel-toed boots, and she had just told him more about the Charger in 20 minutes than 11 specialists had told him in 3 years. and she had said it without performing expertise, without the particular confidence of someone who wanted to be observed being confident. She had said it the way you say something that happens to be true. He said, "When can you start?" she said. "Tomorrow morning, if that works," he said. "I'll have the bay cleared by 8. She left and Holt stood in the back bay alone and looked at the charger and told himself not to hope too much. He had practice at this. He was by now quite skilled at the maintenance of measured expectation. He did not sleep especially well. She arrived at 7:45. Holt was already there. He had been there since 6:30, which he told himself was because he had paperwork to catch up on. The paperwork was on the desk untouched when she walked in. She had a toolbox with her. Not the rolling steel chest of the professional teams who had cycled through the garage over the past 3 years. A mid-size Craftsman box, red, with a dent along the lower left panel and what appeared to be a child's sticker, a faded yellow star, on the handle. It was the kind of toolbox that had been used for actual work for a long time. With her was a girl, 7, maybe 8, with light hair in an uneven ponytail and rubber boots that were slightly too large for her, the left one with a crack at the toe. She was carrying a backpack and a paperback book, and she looked around the garage with the frank assessment of a child who is accustomed to arriving in unfamiliar places and immediately taking inventory. "This is my daughter," Cassidy said. "I hope that's okay." "My sitter canceled." "Of course," Holt said. The girl looked at him. "Hi," she said. "I'm Willa," the girl said. "My mom said we're here to fix a car that a lot of people already tried to fix." "That's right," Holt said. Willa considered this. "That sounds like what she does," she said. Holt looked at Cassidy. Cassidy was already walking toward the back bay with her toolbox. Noah arrived at the garage at 4 in the afternoon, straight from the school bus, with her backpack over one shoulder and her shoes untied in the particular way that meant she had tied them that morning and not revisited the question since. She stopped inside the front door and looked at the back bay, where Willa was sitting on an upturned milk crate doing something with a pencil and a spiral notebook, and at Cassidy's feet, visible beneath the charger. "Who's that?" she asked. "That's Willa," Holt said. "Her mom is looking at your grandfather's car." Noah absorbed this. "How old is she?" 7, Willa said without looking up from her notebook, because she had evidently been listening. "I'm 7 too," Noah said. "I know," Willa said. "Your dad told my mom." "Did he?" Noah said. This was addressed at Holt. "I mentioned it," Holt said. Noah put her backpack on the workbench, took out a notebook of her own, and sat down at the other end of the bench and opened it. She and Willa regarded each other across 15 feet of garage floor with the specific evaluating look of children deciding whether a situation is interesting enough to pursue. Willa turned her notebook around. It was covered in annotated diagrams of what appeared to be the internal combustion cycle, labeled in a child's handwriting, but with an accuracy that made Holt look twice. "My mom's teaching me how engines work," Willa said. Noah looked at the diagrams. "Really? The carburetor is the part that mixes the air and gas," Willa said. "It's old technology. Modern cars use fuel injection, which is better but less interesting to look at." Noah pulled her notebook closer and appeared to be writing something down. Holt went back to the front bay and tried to do paperwork and found he couldn't. Cassidy emerged at 6:30, wiping her hands on a shop rag. She had been under the car for most of the afternoon, and Holt had brought her a coffee at 2 o'clock that she had drunk in 3 minutes without breaking her attention from whatever she was looking at. She stood at the entrance to the back bay and looked at the charger. "I found it," she said. "The modification." "And?" She turned the shop rag in her hands. The ground path runs along the inside of the firewall, integrated behind the factory harness sleeve, so that it looks like original wiring unless you're specifically looking for a secondary circuit. The degraded section is about 14 centimeters, right where the modified harness meets the terminal block. I'll need to reroute the ground path and replace the affected section with period-correct wire. She paused. "It'll probably take me 3 or 4 hours tomorrow." He looked at her. "You found in 2 days what 11 specialists in 3 years couldn't find." She looked at the car. "I wasn't looking for a fault. I was looking at the whole system." "There's a difference," he said. "How is there a difference?" She was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet. "When you look for a fault, you're looking for something that's broken. When you look at the whole system, you're looking at how everything relates to everything else. The fault in this car isn't broken in a way that any individual component test would catch. It only shows up when you see the whole thing together. How the secondary circuit interacts with the factory ignition management. How the thermal cycle of the engine affects the resistance in a specific section of a specific wire. It's not a broken part. It's a conversation between parts that's going wrong in a very particular way, at a very particular moment. He thought about Bertrand from Barry, who had said almost something. I found something I can't explain. Bertrand had been close. He had just been looking at the wrong level. Can I ask you something? She nodded. The modification, the aftermarket security integration. You knew what it was immediately. You said it was a common modification for the Mopar platform in that era. He paused. How do you know that specifically? She looked at him. The reading look, the calculation of how much to say. I didn't just study the Mopar platform, she said. I worked on it, directly. In the 90s, I was part of a team at a company called Northgate Automotive Engineering out of Windsor. We did contract work for aftermarket accessory manufacturers. A lot of what we did in those years was exactly this, integrating secondary systems into factory architectures on classic American performance vehicles. Security systems, upgraded ignition management, auxiliary electrical systems. We knew these platforms the way. She stopped. The way what? Holt said. The way your father knew this engine, she said. By feel, not just by spec. He looked at her for a long moment. She said, I left the industry 12 years ago. After Willa's father died. It wasn't a single decision. It was more like a series of small unavoidable steps away from one version of my life toward another. The work I was doing at Northgate required everything. The hours, the travel, the continuous deep focus. And I had a 4-year-old who needed not more of me, just all of me. Differently. She set the shop rag down on the hood of a customer's pickup. I repair small engines now. Snowblowers, ATVs, chainsaws, the occasional outboard. I work out of a space in my backyard in Huntsville. I set my own hours. I can walk Willa to school. I can be home by 3 when she gets off the bus. She paused. The work doesn't use everything I know, but for a long time that was fine. That was the right size for what I had available. Holt looked at his hands. He knew this particular calculation. He had run his own version of it for 7 years. The math of what you had left over, what you could give, and to what, and how you reorganized your life to make the numbers add up when the original equation no longer existed. He said, You've been fixing snowblowers with an electrical engineering background that includes direct work on the Mopar B-body platform. She said, I've been fixing snowblowers and making Willa's lunches and going to school concerts and being there. He said, There's no version of those things that's the wrong version. She looked at him. He had said it plainly without the self-consciousness that the statement usually attracted in him. It was a true thing, and he had said it the way you say true things when you're tired of the alternative. She said, I know. It just looks different from the inside sometimes. He understood that exactly. She came back the next morning at 7:30. Willa was with her again. Same 2 large rubber boots, different book. Holt had the back bay cleared and the work lights positioned and a fresh pot of coffee made, and told himself this was just standard hospitality, and not anything more than that. He was in the office running invoices at 11:30 when he heard it. The sound moved through the walls of the garage before he understood what it was. It came up through the concrete floor and into his chair and into his chest, and for 3 seconds he did not move because he was not sure the sound was real, and he did not want to be wrong about it. Then he was out of the office and through the front bay and to the entrance of the back bay, and the Charger was running. Not turning over. Not trying. Running. The sound of that 440 engine at idle was not a polite sound. It was a low, rolling, chest-modifying sound that bounced off the concrete floor and the metal walls and came back changed, fuller, louder than the room should have been able to hold. It was the sound of something that had been built in 1969 to be driven fast, which had spent the last 3 years not being driven at all, and which was now demonstrating, with considerable composure, that it remembered exactly what it was. Holt stood in the entrance to the back bay, and his eyes went blurry, which he had not anticipated and could not stop. He had not cried in front of anyone in 7 years. He had cried alone, in the parking lot of the Sudbury Hospital, and in the garage after hours when Vernon had gone home and the shop was closed. He had cried on Clifford's last night, and in the first 6 months after, in the way that grief requires you to cry and does not ask your permission about the timing, but not in front of anyone. He had gotten very good at the management of it. He stood in the entrance of the back bay, with the Charger running and didn't move, and the management stopped working. Cassidy was standing to the left of the car with her arms crossed, watching the engine idle. She looked at Holt. She did not say anything. She did not adjust her expression or perform the particular careful dance that most people perform when they witness someone else's grief unexpectedly. She just let it be there. Stood in the warm running garage while Holt put the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, breathed through his nose, and found his way back. From the corner, Willa said, "You did it, Mom." Cassidy said, "It ran." The distinction Holt would think about later. Not I fixed it, not success. It ran. As though she was being careful not to overstate her relationship to the outcome. As though the car had done something itself, and she had simply removed what was in the way. Vernon arrived at noon with lunch from the diner down the road, which he did every other Friday, and stopped in the entrance of the back bay with a paper bag in each hand, looking at the idling Charger, with the expression of a man who has been told about something repeatedly, and is now confronting the reality of it. "Well," he said. He said it in the specific tone he used for things that defied the comment he actually wanted to make. Noah came at 4, and Holt met her at the front door before she got to the back bay. He told her the car was running. She looked at him the way 7-year-olds look at adults when they detect that something important is being underplayed. "Running like fixed," she said. "Running like fixed," he said. She went directly to the back bay, where Willa was sitting on the milk crate with her engine diagram notebook, and said, without preamble, "Did your mom actually fix it?" Willa said, "She fixed the ground circuit." Noah looked at the car, which had been cut off by then, but which still seemed to occupy the room differently than it had before. Like it had rejoined a conversation. "My grandpa bought this car before my dad was born," Noah said. Willa said, "I know, your dad told my mom." Noah looked at the wall where Clifford's photograph was. "He's the one smiling by the car?" "Yeah." Willa looked at the photograph for a moment. "He looks like your dad," she said. "Something about the way he's standing." Noah considered this. "Dad says that too," she said. She paused. "He says it like it's a hard thing to notice." Willa nodded with the gravity of a child who has grown up close to adult grief and has learned to receive these sentences without flinching. They sat on the milk crates on either side of the garage and did their homework in companionable parallel quiet, which was, Holt thought, watching from the entrance to the front bay, exactly the same way they would have done it even without the Charger, even without any of it. Children have a way of building the present tense out of whatever is available. That evening, after Cassidy had finished and packed her toolbox and written out a summary of the repair on the back of one of Holt's shop invoices, precise, technical, complete, he tried to pay her. She told him what she charged. It was a fraction of what Bertrand had charged for 5 days of not quite solving it, and a fraction of what the teams from Toronto and Ottawa had invoiced. He said, "This isn't enough." She said, "It's what I charge," he said. "You did something 11 people couldn't do." She said, "I knew something they didn't." That's not the same as being better at the work. He looked at her. She was serious about the distinction. He tried to understand why it mattered to her, and thought he understood it. She was not laying claim to something she didn't fully believe she owned anymore. The expertise was hers. The 12 years of distance from the industry was also hers. She was holding both things at the same time with the honesty of someone who has stopped pretending the calculus is simple. He paid her what she charged and added $100 and said the 100 was for Willa's patience, which she accepted. At the door, she stopped. She looked back at the garage, the front bay, the photograph on the back wall. He was good at it, she said. Running a place like this alone, it takes a particular kind of person. Holt said, "He made it look easier than it was." "He always made things look easier than they were." She nodded. She looked at her boots for a moment, the cracked left toe. "My father was a machinist," she said. "Same thing. He could make a lathe sound like it was resting." She paused. "I think they do it on purpose. The good ones. They don't want you to see the effort because they don't want you to feel like you owe them for it." He said, "My dad used to say that the work knows." She said, "Meaning?" He said, "Meaning if you do it right, the work knows. You don't need to tell anyone else." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a good thing to carry." She and Willa got in their car, a Subaru Forester with a cracked rear bumper and a University of Waterloo parking sticker, from what appeared to be 2 institutions ago, and pulled out of the lot. Willa waved at Noah from the back window. Noah waved back. 3 days later, the Charger was in the newspaper. Not the Kinsley Weekly, which had a circulation of 800 and tended to run property tax stories and hockey scores. The story was in the Sudbury Star, picked up from a brief mention on a local interest blog that had posted about the repair. The headline was Huntsville's Woman Solves 3-Year Mystery on Rare Muscle Car After a Leave-In Experts Failed, which Holt found both accurate and somehow insufficient. By the time it ran, the blog post had been shared into a Mopar enthusiast forum with 40,000 members and a Facebook group for vintage Canadian vehicle restoration that had more members than that, and the phone at Beaumont's garage had rung 7 times before 10 in the morning. Cassidy called at noon. She had seen the article. "How bad?" she said. "It's moving," he said. "I've had calls from 2 journalists, a television crew from North Bay, and a man in Arizona who wants to buy the car." She was quiet, then, "Tell him it's not for sale." "It's not my car to sell," Holt said, "and I'll tell him." She said, "The journalists." He said, "I told them I wasn't commenting. They'll find you eventually." She said, "I know. I've already had an email from someone." She paused. Willa's school called, just to let me know that Willa had been asked about her mother by other kids. She paused again. She told them I fixed a car that nobody else could fix, and that this was not unusual. He felt something shift in his chest, the specific feeling of a true thing arriving. "Did she?" "Yeah. She said she was going to need a better explanation if people were going to keep asking. So could I please explain it again more carefully?" He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "I told her the truth, that I knew something about this specific type of car because of work I did a long time ago. That sometimes you know things from an old version of your life that turn out to be useful in a new one." She said, she asked if that meant the old version wasn't wasted. "Was it?" She said. I told her no version is wasted. You just don't always know what it's for while you're living it. He stood in the front bay of his father's garage with the phone in his hand, and the afternoon light coming through the single north-facing window the way it came every afternoon, flat and honest, and he thought about what Cassidy had said to Willa. No version is wasted. You just don't always know what it's for while you're living it. He had a version of that thought himself. He had carried some form of it since the parking lot in Sudbury, through the years of the garage and the school pickups, and the Saturday mornings when Noah came with him to rotate inventory and complained about it while doing it thoroughly. He had carried it without ever quite articulating it to himself the way she had just articulated it to him in a sentence. He said, "I need to ask you something." She said, "Okay." He said, "The firm you mentioned, Northgate Automotive Engineering, they're still operating out of Windsor?" "Yes," he said. "Have you thought about going back?" A long silence, not the thinking silence. The other one, she said, "I've thought about it. I think about a lot of things. I think about whether I'm giving Willa enough, whether I'm using what I know well enough, whether there's a version of this," she paused, "where I don't have to choose between being present and being what I was trained to be." He said, "Is there?" She said, "I don't know. I've been treating it like there isn't." He said, "That might not be accurate." She said, "No, it might not." He said, "I know a few people in the Windsor automotive circle. Not Northgate specifically, but adjacent. If you wanted an introduction, a quiet one, no pressure, I could make a call." She was quiet again. He said, "I'm not suggesting you leave Huntsville or change your schedule. I'm suggesting that someone who solved a problem 11 specialists couldn't solve might have more options than she currently believes she has," she said. "That's a generous way to frame it," he said. "It's the accurate way to frame it." Another silence. Then, "Let me think about it." He said, "Take whatever time you need." She said, "How's the car?" He said, "I drove it this morning, just to the highway and back. It drove exactly the way my dad said it drove, like it was arguing with the road." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." He said, "He would have liked you." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you cared about what the car actually was, not what it cost, not what it represented as a problem to be solved. You treated it like the thing it was." She said, "It wasn't hard. You could see what it was from the beginning." He said, "Most people couldn't." She said, "Most people weren't looking at the whole system." He understood she wasn't talking only about the car. He drove the Charger properly for the first time in the 3rd week of October. On a Saturday morning when Noah was at hockey practice and the road north of Kinsley was clear and the maples had gone the full range of October color. He drove it the way his father had described driving it in the early years, with both hands on the wheel and his attention completely given over to the conversation between the car and the road. The engine sound at speed was not polite. It was enormous and deliberate, and it came through the seat and the wheel and the floor and into his sternum. He drove for 40 minutes without stopping, and when he pulled back into the garage lot and cut the engine, he sat in the driver's seat for a long time without getting out. He thought about his father at a highway stoplight outside Timmins in 1987, in an October snowstorm, in a car that cost him $3,000, and which he would never sell and never stop believing in. He thought about what it meant to take care of something for 30 years, and what it meant to lose the use of it, and what it meant to leave it to someone who would understand what it was worth. He thought about the parking lot in Sudbury, and about the years that had come after, and about Noah at 7 with her uneven hockey ponytail and her notebook full of questions, and about Cassidy Webb lying on the concrete floor of the back bay, looking at the undercarriage of a car that had defeated 11 people before her, looking not for the fault, but at the whole system, at how everything connected. He thought about what she had said to Willa. No version is wasted. You just don't always know what it's for while you're living it. He went inside and called the number he had mentioned. Cassidy called him back 6 days later. She had talked to a contact at Northgate, she said. She was not going to make any immediate decisions. But they had talked for 2 hours, and the conversation had been, she said, carefully, the kind she hadn't had in 12 years. The kind where someone was asking her specific technical questions, and the answers came up out of her without effort, the way knowledge does when it has been sitting in you long enough to become reflex. She said, Willa asked me again last night about the old version versus the new version. He said, what did you tell her? She said, I told her I was thinking about whether they had to be different versions, whether I could be both at the same time. He said, what did she say? She said that seemed obvious. He said, 7-year-olds. She said, they don't have the same patience for false dilemmas. He said, no, they don't. She said, I told her we might have to change a few things. The schedule, some of the routines. She asked if she'd still be able to come to the garage in Kinsley. He went quiet. She said, I told her I thought that was likely. He said, she can come whenever she wants. She said, that's what I told her. A pause. The kind that doesn't need filling. He said, how's the Forester? She said, the rear wheel bearing is starting to go. I can feel it on the highway. He said, bring it by. She said, I'm not paying your rate. He said, I wasn't going to charge you. She said, then I'm definitely not coming. He said, I'll charge you the Willa discount. A silence. Then what might have been a laugh, brief, surprised at itself. She said, I'll think about it. He said, that's good enough. The Charger sat in the back bay that evening with all the light off except the small amber work light above the photograph, and Holt stood in the entrance for a while, the way his father had stood in this same entrance on the evenings he'd come out to check on something that didn't need checking on. The car was not a monument. That was the thing he had been slowly understanding since October. It had been a monument for 3 years, while it sat silent and unreachable and expensive and impossible. But now it was a car again, his father's car, a car that argued with the road and had a second electrical circuit hidden in the factory harness, and which had been fixed not by anyone who came looking for a fault, but by someone who had stood back and looked at the whole thing and seen how everything connected. That was the lesson, maybe. Not the technical one, the other one. The best things, the ones worth keeping, the ones worth the effort of 3 years and 11 attempts, and more money than you should have spent. The best things reveal themselves to people who are willing to look at the whole system, who don't arrive with a list of faults to find, but with the patience to see what's actually there. He turned off the work light. He locked the back bay. He went home. Noah was in the kitchen doing homework with her shoes still on, which he had given up correcting, and the television was on low in the other room. And the house smelled like the pasta she had attempted to start before he got home, which had resulted in competent water boiling and nothing else. How was it? She said. He said, good. She said, did you drive it again? He said, for a bit. She looked up from her homework. Her mother's ears, his habit of quietness when he was thinking hard about something. She said, what does it feel like? He thought about how to answer. Like he's still here, he said. In the arguing with the road way, not the sad way. She considered this. Then she went back to her homework, the pencil moving in the careful, deliberate style of someone who is giving everything to the problem in front of her. He started the pasta.